Welcome. This is the Public Affairs program sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. We're located at 4700 Grover Avenue in North Central Austin. My name is Luther Elmore. We hold these public affairs discussions most Sundays, and we've been doing that since this church was first incorporated in 1954. As far as we know, this is the longest continuously operating public affairs forum in the state of Texas. We sponsor these programs to nourish souls, to serve social justice. These are held Sundays at noon at our location, and although you can watch them online and on YouTube, we do invite you to join us so that you can ask your questions yourself. Information about this is on our church website, austinuu.org. To introduce our speaker today, we have one of our longtime serving members of the Forum Committee, Mr. Eric Hartman, and he will introduce our speaker. Eric.
Thank you, Luther. It's my honor to introduce State Representative Gina Hinojosa today as our speaker for the first public forum of 2019. The Texas legislature notoriously can be a hard place for folks with progressive principles. And it helps if lawmakers arrive with some background in issue advocacy and community organizing, because they're going to be doing both of those things at the Capitol. And that's exactly the background that Representative Gina Hinojosa has brought to her work at the Capitol since she was elected as a state rep in 2016. As an attorney, she represented both organized workers in the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, workers who did not have the benefit of a union but who needed help in vindicating their rights in the workplace, like those fighting wage theft in this community. She served as an advocate for immigrant rights in another of her capacities. She worked as a leader within Austin Interfaith on the campaign for living wage in this community, and I think has devoted herself to the cause of providing for a better life for Texas families, not just here in Austin. She's perhaps best known to some of you for her work before she came to the legislature on the Austin School Board, where she became the president of the board and was a leader in the fight for services for kids and for decent public funding of public education. And she, even before she got to the legislature, she was busy trying to organize a bipartisan coalition at the Capitol in support of that cause of appropriate funding for our public schools and students. That's going to be one of the hottest topics of this legislative session, so she's well armed and ready for her role in that fight. She also is going to be fully engaged, I'm sure, in the ongoing battle over the state dictating to local communities whether or not they can make progressive advances on issues such as single-use bag restrictions on retailers. I think you've already got some legislation that would address what the state has done to us on that. So you're going to be in the thick of it, and you'll be in a position to tell us today, I think, about the implications of the gains that Democrats made at the polls in November, the implications of having this person named Dennis Bonnen as the probable Speaker of the House in just a couple of days from now, and to let you just carry on and tell us what we're in for, I'm going to stand aside and let you speak and let folks ask you some questions. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to all of you for attending this morning and for the invitation to address you again about my work and in ways that you can help in our work at the Texas legislature. As Eric mentioned, I did get my start in Austin politics through my own church. And it was through a program at my Catholic church called Just Faith, where we focused very much on social justice issues in the church. And through that effort, or that initiative, Austin Interfaith got to know some of us who were doing that work and brought us into the local organizing that it was doing. And so very much I see my work at the legislature, my work in the community as part of my beliefs, my faith. And so I appreciate that you all here see that connection too, and are called to act because of your faith. So nobody really knows what this session has in store for us. We will have a new speaker, and because Joe Strauss did not run for re-election, and he has been our speaker for the last several sessions. And probably this person named Dennis Bonnen, and he's been in the legislature since he was in his 20s. So he's been around for a long time, knows the House very well. He has demonstrated names of the votes that he has to be speaker, and I have no reason to doubt that that is indeed what will happen. And so really it's anyone's guess what kind of speaker he will be. I had a good meeting with him wherein he shared to me his desire to have the House lead on school finance issues, and as Eric mentioned, many, if not everyone, many legislators, if not all, have stated that school finance is everyone's number one priority. That's great, but that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so it will be very important going into this session that we are all on the same page with what we mean by school finance work in the Texas legislature. I want to talk a little bit about what that means to me, and I think it's going to be important that we all are on the same basic page when it comes to facts around our school finance system. You may know that last session, the governor, through the governor's prompting, we passed a school finance commission that met over the interim, and that just in December introduced a report wherein it recommended some changes to the school finance system. It was very short on how much money we would need. It was very short on where we'd get that money. The governor himself has proposed a plan that is mostly a property tax reduction plan that he says the money will be made up for our schools through state funding, but still we're light on specifics about where that funding will come from. So if we can back up for a bit, I want us to all start with the same understanding about school finance. School finance in the state of Texas is notoriously very, very complicated, and only about a handful of people really, truly understand it in the state of Texas. But some basic understanding of how it works today is this. We all know that we operate under a recapture or a Robin Hood type system where property wealthy school districts pay into the state money so that is supposed to then be sent to property poor school districts. So that, and the theory behind that is that all children deserve access to a good education despite the ability of their local property taxpayers to pay for that. And I believe generally in that. I'm originally from Brownsville, Texas, and while I'm too old to have been a beneficiary of the Robin Hood system, I understand why it's necessary, and I support the basic concept of an equitable school finance system. The problem today is that the formula that is used to decide who gets what and who gives what hasn't been updated for 30 years. And so in this complex formula, a fundamental component of it is something that is called the cost of education index. And you can think of it as the cost of doing business, cost of living, basically, figure. And so this cost of education index is assigned to every school district in the state of Texas, and it's the cost of doing business in that district. Well, Austin's, because this hasn't been updated in 30 years, Austin's on par with Killeen in terms of what it costs to do business to operate our schools. Now, we all know, and especially if we've lived here for a long time, that there's no truth to that, because the cost of doing business in Austin is probably the highest, if not one of the highest in the whole state. And it's not what it was 30 years ago when Austin was a smaller kind of college town. Now we operate one of the largest school districts in the state, and our cost of housing is one of the highest. And so we have many teachers who now can't afford to live in Austin because of the cost of housing. And so it makes sense to me that a teacher who works in Austin should be paid substantially more than a teacher who works somewhere where their housing isn't as high or their cost of living isn't as high, because I do believe that teachers should be able to live in the communities in which they teach. So that's one of the biggest challenges with our school finance system, is that it just hasn't been updated in so years, and it hasn't been updated in so many years because there are winners and losers if you update it, if you don't expand the pie, right? If we're operating with the same amount of money, then if somebody gets more, somebody's going to get less. And so I think it's important, as we approach a solution to our school finance dilemma, that we are looking at more money so that it's not a winner and loser kind of thing. Not to mention the fact that currently the formula does not account for inflation. So we've gone many years without increasing how much money we're putting in because of inflation. And we all know that the cost of everything has gone up, and that we need to be, and school districts have to pay more for health care, among other things. And so the state should be taking that into account. So here's what you should know about, but let me stop right there and say this. I want to make what I think is a very important point as we move forward. While Austin is paying more than $600 million into the state school finance system, and that hurts us in a unique way. And there's no doubt about it. And if you've been reading the news within the last year and beyond, you know that AISD is facing some really tough choices because of all the money, because they have less and less money to work with. It's at this point a majority of the maintenance and operation tax that AISD collects is going to the state, and that is not a sustainable thing we can be doing. But all that being said, all school districts that have seen an increase in their property tax wealth, in the value of their property, all school districts, whether they're a property wealthy school district or a property poor school district, if their property wealth has gone up because the value of their property has gone up, as is the case in Austin, then they're getting a decrease in state funding. So in a sense, I like to say we are all in recapture. We are all in the same boat, where the state is contributing less as the school district's wealth is going up. And so really we're all in a situation where we need it to be fixed. Here's what you need to know. Overall, the picture for our schools, it would cost about $2.6 billion annually to keep up with inflation. That's a sizable number, and one that we have not been keeping up with. And so we are at a point now where we still have not caught up in overall spending, not just local versus state. In overall spending, we are spending less in our classrooms and instructional spending than we were before the 2011 cuts. There were big cuts to public education in 2011, and we still have not caught up to that spending. So overall, we're down. And what does that look like in terms of kind of national perspective? Texas ranks 42nd in the state in school funding. And not only do we rank towards the bottom, but we spend about $2,300 less per student than the national average. So it's not just that the state is contributing less and our property taxes are contributing more. It's that also overall, our kids are getting less towards their education. But here's what the state versus local picture looks like. So in 2008, the state contribution to public education versus our local property taxes was about 50-50. And today, going into this next biennium, it looks like the state will be contributing only about 33.9% for our ISDs, while property taxes, while local districts, our property taxes pick up the 66.1%. So that's the imbalance now. And what happens as we give more, as the state contributes less, and they're putting that money into other priorities. So we think we're spending more and more and more of our property taxes. We should be getting more and more for public education, or maybe some other school district, poor school district, is getting it. That's not happening. What's happening is that amount is stagnant. That's going into overall education in the state, and the state is just putting less and less and less into education. So that is the reality of our school finance situation now, with one exception, and the one exception is charter schools. Because for charter schools, the state funds 100% of the cost of a charter school. And so what that spending looks like right now is that by 2019, state aid for charter schools will double, paying an average of $900 more per child annually than it did in 2014. If you look at our ISDs, since 2014, state aid has decreased $1.5 billion for our ISDs. So it's gone up $1.46 billion and gone up $1.46 billion for our charter schools, while it's gone down $1.5 billion for our ISDs. And because that is the state funds 100% of our charter schools, with the exponential growth of our charter schools, the state is putting in more and more money towards our charter schools. And when you look at it from a local level, our charter schools are getting substantially more per student than their counterpart ISDs. So in terms of instructional spending. So if you look at Austin, for example, a student in a charter school in Austin gets $1,740 more than a student in AISD. And that's the makeup of that's all together, of the local and the state in terms of instructional spending. In Dallas, a student in a charter school gets $1,895 more than a student in Dallas ISD. In Houston, a student in a charter school gets $1,806 more for their education than a student in HISD. So the other part of that is that charter schools don't take all kids. And I say this because charter schools are allowed to exclude kids with disciplinary histories in their schools. A child with a disciplinary record can be kept out of a charter school, whereas a child in an ISD cannot. Our ISDs have to take all kids, right? And so last session I had a bill that said charter schools, if you take public money, you got to take all kids. And the Charter School Association opposed it, but we made progress in educating people about the reality of what's going on, and including with legislators. And I was proud to have had the support of a majority of the Public Education Committee, even supporters of charter schools who saw that just wasn't fair. And but unfortunately, we weren't able to get a vote to get that out of committee. But I have filed that again. And the reason why this is so important to me, and I think to our schools, is because what's happening right now is we have parallel school systems. Parallel school systems funded by taxpayer money. One has to take all kids, one doesn't. The one that doesn't is getting more money, and it's leaving our ISDs, our neighborhood public schools, with a greater percentage of kids who are the most challenging to educate with less resources. Charter schools were supposed to be a laboratory of experiment wherein we would try new things and then use those for our public schools. Charter schools were never supposed to be a parallel school system that was equally funded by our taxpayer. We have no end game here. Charter schools can just expand wherever with no notice to ISDs. An ISD could decide, I'm going to build a school in this new subdivision because there are all these families there. A charter school can pop up, and then there's just a bunch of wasted taxpayer money. So there's no strategy really for how we're using these charter schools to improve our overall public school system. And in fact, I believe because charter schools don't have to take all kids, that it is sinking our ISDs under the weight of a critical mass of kids with the biggest challenges. So that is going to be another one of my priorities this next session. And let me give you an example of the money that we're talking about that we could use in our public schools if we could right-size some of the challenges with our charter schools. So if charter schools receive the same funding as ISDs, where they, like if, let's say, Southwest, I think Southwest Key's biggest charter school is in Austin. I think they have most of their kids in Austin. So say if they were to receive the same amount of funding that Austin ISD kids receive, if we were to do that all over the state with all charter schools, we would save the state $882 million in the current biennium. $882 million, to give you a sense of what that could buy. That could buy half the cost of full-day pre-K statewide. So it's significant money, and it's money that we need for our public school kids. So that's school finance. I probably spent a half hour talking about school finance, but that's a passion of mine. But this session, I tried to group my efforts, my legislative efforts, into categories to make it easier for me to explain what I'm doing. This session, I have the category of healthy communities I'm working on, which includes trying to get filed a Medicare for All bill, a bill on gun safety, a bill on access to long-acting reversible contraceptive for women. So that's my healthy communities category of work. I have a resilient community categories of work, and those are my environmental bills. I will be refiling again the bill that says that a locality, that a city can ban the use of plastic bags. Last session we filed that and got it out of committee for the first time ever, and so we're coming back with that bill. So it's resilient communities, environmental bills. I have a dam safety bill that I'm filing under that. So does anybody remember this Austin American Statesman series on dam safety in the state? It terrified me. And so we got to work looking into what was going on, and it turns out that the state gets information on hazards about dams in the state of Texas, and that our local emergency management people don't get that information, which is scary. So I have filed a bill to say we need to get that information. And the reason they don't get it is because of trying to secure the information so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But I think that our emergency management, we can have limited people within our local communities have access to that information to keep us all safe. And the final kind of bucket of work that I've categorized as equitable communities. So there is my charter discipline bill. There I am working on a bill to file for our Rosedale school that's not very far away, that educates kids who are medically fragile and and for those of you who don't know Rosedale, it's a very special school. There are a few like it in the state, and children have severe disabilities in this school. I went to their graduation when I was on the school board, and it's tragic and sad. Kids that don't graduate often don't live to graduation. That's how severe their disabilities are. Many of them are non-responsive, nonverbal. And so these kids have to be given the STAR test. They are under the state accountability test, and it makes me crazy. I heard from district officials about teachers chasing kids down with these tests, and it made me livid. So they did not meet state accountability standards this last year. The district appealed it, and the TEA said it was okay. But this happens every time, and this is ridiculous, and it's not appropriate for these kids. And so that's under my Equitable Communities work. Now, I have a sign-up sheet somewhere. Eric has a sign-up sheet that he's going to be passing around. Last session, we instituted engagement teams for our work. And, I was a freshman last session. I say that I built the car as I was driving it. But I knew that people in my district, after the 2016 election, were very eager to be more involved in our government and our policy making. And so we had to figure out a way to harness and use that energy and expertise. And so we made these engagement teams, and we're doing it again. And Eric's going to be passing around a sign-up sheet for these engagement teams where we're having our first one in a couple of weeks, where we're going to talk about what people would like to focus on this session and ideas and strategies for being engaged this session. Now, you should know that this is not ever going to be used for political partisan reasons. I have state employees who work on this, and so I cannot use this for political partisan reasons. So you should never get an email or a phone call to elect Gina from this. That you have to sign up Gina for Austin to do that. But if you ever do get something, let me know immediately, because that cannot be happening. So just so you know, that's what that list is for. School finance is what everybody's focused on. Healthcare is another issue that we hear from everyone that is a priority for families. And we know that we need to expand Medicaid to pull down billions more in healthcare funding in Texas. And I'm working on a Medicare for All bill, because I believe that healthcare is a right and not a privilege, and we need to figure out a way to get all of our families covered. Another big focus this session will be Harvey recovery, right? Because we were hit in the interim with Hurricane Harvey, and it caused billions of damage, and communities are still struggling with how to recover and rebuild. And so that's something that I anticipate we will be focused on too. Now, what is relevant this session, we will have a new speaker, but we also have 12 new Democrats in the Texas House. So in other words, there were 12 Republican seats that flipped and Democrats won them. So at this point, Democrats are 8 down from parity, 9 down from control in the Texas House. I say that because it should make for a different dynamic and for different policy coming out of the House. We should not be dealing with the same kind of bathroom bills, focus on the issues that are mostly of concern to Republican primary voters, because more people are focused on the general election, because not only did we pick up 12 seats, but there were something like 17 Republican seats that Democrats lost by less than 5 points. So my hope is that Republicans will be more focused on bipartisan legislation and more focused on their general election than in the prior session. My sense last session was that I worked with a lot of Republican colleagues who vote the way they vote because they fear repercussions for not voting that way in their primaries. It's such a small sliver of people vote in both primaries, actually. But in the Republican primary, you have only the most extreme people generally who are voting. Probably same on the Democratic primary, right? We have both extremes of the partisan divide who primarily vote in primaries. And so I had one member tell me once, Gina, I know that bill is, and he used an expletive, but I'm not going to say it in a sanctuary. So I know that bill is blank crazy, but I have to vote for it or I'll get primaried. And so, my experience living in Austin for over 20 years has been one really of living in a bubble where a lot of people think like me. And I never had really been in a work environment where I was working with mostly Republicans, frankly. And I really didn't know what to expect when I went to the House last session. And my general sense was that we're not all that far apart in terms of our beliefs. What makes us so far apart is who we are responsive to in terms of the electorate. And I think generally, look, everybody was focused on getting out the vote for the general election. That was good, and that did us a lot of good for this session. And we need to keep doing that. But just as important for us is that we get out the vote in our primaries. I think if we could do that, then we would have politicians that were more interested in finding common ground, and we would have less extreme politics. And so I think our biggest challenge this session now is for House members and Senate too. They picked up 2 new Democrats in the Senate too. But for us to understand what it is to have power and to own that power. And I say that not to discount what I just said before about extreme politics. I don't say that to say we should try to run over anybody. I say that to say it should give us confidence in representing our communities and what we know that our communities really want. And I see some of you here who have come to the legislature, for instance, on common sense gun laws. That is something that the vast majority of Texans support. Vast majority of Texans support universal background checks. But you wouldn't know it by talking to legislators in the Texas House or in the Senate, because the body has been very focused on what the extreme in the Republican primary wants. And so our challenge will be to own and harness the power we got in this last election and the momentum that we got in this last election. I have the extreme fortune of representing this district, Austin, Texas, where my electorate makes sure that I'm engaged and responsive and I know what's going on. People say to me, "Oh, thank you so much for everything you do." And I say, "But don't thank me. Do you know who I represent?" I'm required to do what I do by the community I represent. And it's half in jest, but you all know it's true. So I feel like I'm connected in a way that that maybe not everybody is. And so, how do I want to say this? So I understand the energy and the expectations of you all. And I just hope that we all understand that energy and the expectations that Texans have for this coming session. Because also, we have one more election cycle, and then that's the body in the House that's going to do redistricting. And we do redistricting not just for the Texas House, but that's important, but we draw the lines for the congressional seats, the Texas congressional seats as well. And since we have second only to California, most amount of seats, that's a big deal nationally, and a big responsibility and a big opportunity, because those are the seats that we should have for 10 years. So everything is on the line, really, this next session and this next election. And I fully understand that. I know you all fully understand that, and we need to make sure that everybody does. And with that, I'd like to take any questions that you all might have.
Thank you, Representative Hinojosa. That if you would hold up your hand, I'll come around to you. Please keep your questions, identify yourself, and keep your questions short so that Representative Hinojosa can answer as many questions as possible.
You mentioned earlier that Governor Abbott was going to cut property taxes and then make up the difference with some other state funding. What are the sources of other state funding that might be available?
Well, he hasn't said what he anticipates. I do think some of the funding that is available is funding that we would spend on growth in charter schools. I think that is a place where we can find some money. There are some who are looking at rolling back some tax exemptions, and I'm still looking at that too, that we have a rainy day fund that is the largest of any state in the country, and that is a potential source for especially one-time funding. You know, we've had these school shootings in our country and in our state that have focused a lot of Texans and legislators on solutions, school safety solutions. Some of those will be some hardening of schools is the way that people put it. And to give you an example, some of our schools were built at a time when this wasn't a concern, and so they're pretty open. And some communities would like some permanent solutions to to limit access to those schools. And those would probably be mostly one-time funding initiatives. So the rainy day fund is a potential source for that as well.
Margaret Borden, I'm not sure of the state in California of the single primary vote where everybody runs in the primary together. Also on the bipartisan, non-political districts that do the district, define what the districts are. Any sense among legislators who are tired of extreme people, the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, of looking at either of those or both of those possibilities down the road?
Well, I know that Donna Howard has filed a bill, and I think this is what you're talking about. I understand that California, the single primaries, but I know Donna Howard has filed a bill to create citizen commissions for redistricting, and that would go a long way in reversing that tail wagging the dog phenomena where legislators are drawing their own lines to keep them as opposed to representing the communities that they should be representing. So that bill has been filed. I think it'll be hard to get that bill passed this session, but we should try. I mean, we should try to push. I think it's a good idea. But I also think that if we have more parity in the House, we will have fairer lines, and they won't be drawn so one-sided. Look, we picked up 12 seats, and that's with Democrats jumping over those redistricting lines that were so skewed in favor of Republican incumbents, right? And we did that in the state, we did it across this country because 10 years ago, Republicans had the foresight to focus on state house or state legislative elections to have those majorities to control the drawing of the lines nationwide. And so all over this country, Democrats were able to jump those lines that were drawn against them. But if we had more parity, we would have more fair lines as well.
Dale Beulah, we're glad you're here today.
Thank you.
You did mention environment as one of your concerns, which really pleased me. Right now, last month, the National Assessment on Climate was issued by the Trump administration. Texas is in the bullseye of this tragedy that's going to be happening in the next few decades. I'm wondering how many forest fires and floods and hurricanes and droughts will it take before our legislature even acknowledges that this is going to bankrupt our state?
Well, I appreciate that point, and it makes sense to me that as we are pulling down these billions of federal dollars, as we're making these large investments to rebuild after Harvey, that we are doing it in a way that creates resilient communities, and that you've heard probably nationally some talk of a Green New Deal, how we should be investing money for tomorrow's economy that take into account climate change and the severity of the coming the consequences of our irresponsibility when it comes to our environment. I think it's an opportunity where we could, in Texas, use that money to create a sort of Green New Deal. We don't have the current leadership to do that, unfortunately, and so we've been working closely on some initiatives with some labor unions to, at minimum, try to do rebuilding in a way that is that builds resilient families, that brings in labor unions and trains people for those rebuilding. But the environmental aspect is still something that is an uphill battle for us, and it's just going to take politically more work. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's a concern to me. I have young children. I'm terrified by the reports that have been coming lately that show how dire the situation is.
Laying aside Bob Bullock's solution perhaps to finance the income tax and the issues surrounding property valuation, which on very large commercial and residential properties are out of whack. With respect to charter schools, they get more money, as you say, 100%. One of the arguments I've heard coming from the charter school position is that is because, unlike ISD schools, they don't have the real estate. And that's used as the basis for the larger amount.
They don't have the what? I'm sorry?
They don't have the ownership interest in the real estate. The
Oh, I
schools
see.
do, so they need the money also to take care of their real estate expenses. How do you meet that argument? I hear it frequently.
Well, that's a really good point and a good question. Even when you take into account the bond debt, districts have two sources of revenue, local revenue. They have the maintenance and operation, which is used for just that, operating schools and maintaining schools. And then they have the bond INS to build new schools, right? And it's true, charter schools can't go to voters and say, help me fund bonds. They do take out bonds, and those bonds are secured by the Permanent School Fund that is a statewide fund, so they do get state help for their facilities in that respect. But even when you take into account the average INS payment that districts make, charter schools still get several $100s more per student in funding. And by the way, also last session, we pass in our school finance plan that no Democrat voted for a bill to give charter schools facilities funding. And so, but the other difference is, I was on the school board. It is a hard sell to go to a community and say, we need to raise your taxes to build another school, and we have to make a case, and it's a partnership with a community, and we work out a plan together. And of course, charter schools have no accountability to the community in terms of that money, like how that money is going to be spent, where, etc.
The legislature recently has seemed to try to take away Austin's ability to regulate our sick leave, our ride share, our energy policies. What is your sense of what we have coming, and what should we be doing about it?
Well, last session, I explained to you I have 3 different categories of work that I'm focused on. Last session, one of my categories of work was local control, because it seemed to be one of the defining issues going into the session. We had a governor who was very focused. He's our same governor, but then he was very focused on going after Austin on sanctuary cities and on also tree ordinances, on all sorts of issues. We've heard less of that this session. There will certainly be some of it. Paul Workman, who was a representative representing Austin, had filed some of those bills taking away Austin's control or undoing some of the ordinances that the city of Austin had passed, and he didn't get reelected. So in some sense that maybe decrease the workload a little bit, because Austin is always the whipping child. We are made the example of in this state, and it's gratuitous. I mean, I remember one tweet by a colleague of mine coming down on Austin about lemonade stands, and I said, can you please stop? I mean, I don't go and tell you like what they should be doing in Dallas about lemonade stands, so just like mind your own business. But so we'll see. I mean, it's going to be really interesting, because this last election should have taught people some lessons. Now, we'll have to see whether it did or not. But even Dan Patrick, who liked to champion some of those anti-local control issues, he ran against a not very well-funded opponent and didn't do so well. So it should have chastened everybody, but I don't know that it will. You wonder if some of these people aren't incorrigible, but so we'll just have to see. I'm not anticipating it to the same level as last time around.
In this last election, Democrats did very well in the House, and some of these statewide office holders barely were reelected. And I'm wondering if you see that as a trend of a change in the electorate, or is that a Beto O'Rourke phenomenon?
That's a great question. I do see it as a change, and I do see that a lot of people were excited about Beto, but I went with some other women legislators to other parts of the state. Celia Israel, who's a representative here in Austin, she organized a Don't Mess with Texas Women bus tour. And we didn't have a bus, but we still went. And there were we blocked walk for some Democratic House members or candidates. And there were people who said to us, yes, I'll support your candidate, but I won't support Beto. And I was surprised by that. And so I don't know. I mean, look, I think everybody, what I loved about this last session was this last election, every day I learned about some great new initiative or effort somebody was doing to get out the vote. in a substantial way. Everybody was doing everything they could. It was such a layered approach to this election. I found it refreshing that no single group came out and declared responsibility for our great wins, because everybody knew that it took us all. We all put in the work. So, yes, Betha was a great candidate, brought great energy and inspiration, but there was so much more happening, and I think we need to appreciate that. We need to give it that level of effort every single time. It can't just be Bethomania. It's got to be, this is what we do in a democracy every single time. We all go vote. We all make sure everybody we know is voting. We all learn the issues. We all give it everything we've got. And I think the 2016 election opened our eyes for many of us and woke us up to what it takes to keep a democracy strong. And so it is in Texas, people have always said we're a non-voting state, not a red state. And we did much better in Texas, but we still have a long way to go to get out the vote.
Is there any way, this is probably a dumb question, is there any way that we here can have any influence on legislators from other places? I mean, they represent their area. I'm just curious, is there any way, we can write letters to newspapers in their area. Is there anything else we can do to influence other legislators? You see it from the inside.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any ideas?
Yes. We have the luxury of being here in the city that our capital is located. So we have access to these legislators in a way most people in this state do not. And I do think it's important that we take advantage of that by testifying on bills. I have seen where people who had gone to testify or to speak to me as a school board member who were not very persuasive to the school board, go to the public ed committee and speak and be engaged in a meaningful way, because that's who shows up. And this was as a school board member, and I was very surprised, but it's just a matter of being present, and showing up matters. I also do think that when we take the big votes on the floor, so you go and you show up to testify at the committee hearings, but then if it passes committee, and then it makes it to a floor vote, it's important that you're there for the vote. We had a terrible, probably the worst day of session last session was when Senate Bill 4 passed. And that was the Show Me Your Papers bill. Some people refer to it as the anti-sanctuary city bill, but then everybody admitted that there's no sanctuary city in the state of Texas, so that didn't make sense. So I think it's a Show Me Your Papers bill, because now the law is, because of that bill, that if somebody gets pulled over for a minor traffic violation, that there cannot be a policy by a police chief to say, we don't ask about immigration status. An officer can ask about immigration status, call INS or call ICE. And so I think it's a Show Me Your Papers bill law. Now, that bill passed out of committee. It came to the House floor, and it got substantially worse on the House floor. And really, there was nobody there to watch this happen. And hindsight's 20/20, but I wonder if they'd been watched, if they might have hesitated a little bit more to make it so much worse. I think it's important. I always say that the only time we win is when we shine a light on our issues. And so I always love, I sat by the press last session, and people said, oh, that's where they put the freshmen, nobody wants to sit there. And I said, I love to sit there, because we'll lose when nobody knows about what's happening. We win when people know and understand. And I think that we have a better chance of winning when people know they're being watched. It's like anything. What's that children's book with the digger and he's digging a hole? Mike Milligan, yes, Mike Milligan and his steam shovel. And there's a line, and he says, they dig just a little bit faster, just a little bit better when they're being watched. And that's like all of us, right? We're better when we're watched.
Thanks, Gina. I'm David Overton. And this is a very related question. The Unitarians have a statewide justice ministry, and we do a lobby day every session. It'll be on March 20th this year.
Great.
Maybe 200 to 300 of us will show
Wow.
up.
Great.
What can we do to make lobby days as effective as possible?
Well, I think that Austin has a reputation of amongst other legislators as, look, just like I lived in a bubble and didn't really know what it would be like to engage with a bunch of Republicans. Many of them don't know what it's like to engage with Austin liberals, right? And so I do encourage people to do what you can to get before, if you can, other members from elsewhere, but even other staff members, because I think it's important that they see we're just concerned community members just like they have in their own communities. We're not the boogeyman, we are reasonable people, and they can engage with us in a reasonable way. So I do think just personalizing who we are is important. And let me say that it's not just for Republicans, it's also for Democrats, because people have a perception of who we are, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, that we can improve by engaging with them in a respectful way. I also think that we're real smart people here, and we have lots of expertise, and that's important, and it's good to be right on the data and the facts. But sometimes we lose sight of the fact that one of the most powerful points of persuasion for a legislator can be a personal story. And so to share how something affects you personally is probably going to be remembered oftentimes more than a certain data point. Both are important, but let's not forget that sharing how this impacts this law that you're going to vote, this bill that you're going to vote on, this impacts me or my family or my neighbor, and this is why it's important to me.
Representative Hinojosa, thank you very much for being with us
My
today.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.